Hey there, my name is Jared, and welcome to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. In this episode, we'll be checking out Taoism, the ideas, philosophies, practices, and stories await. Welcome to the show. Taoism practices, ideas, and philosophies are often easily mistaken for just Chinese culture. The yin-yang symbol, Tai-chi, both a martial art and relaxing form of movement, as well as other forms of martial arts like Wu Wei. These are all references to Taoism, as well as the concepts each contain. In the first section, we'll get into some history, the alleged founder Lao Tzu, where Taoism comes from. In the next section, we'll get into the belief system, what Taoists believe. And in the last section, we'll hear a story or two to get a sense of how Taoism is lived out, much more like a philosophy rather than practice as a religion. Before we go to break, here's some food for thought. Which came first, Taoism or Buddhism? We'll be right back in just a minute. Welcome back to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. Let's jump right into the controversial Lao Tzu and the history of Taoism. Taoism, also spelled with a D, or Taoism, usually spelled with a T, but you can also spell it with a D, began about the same time as Confucianism. Not easy to say, admittedly. In or around the 6th century BC. In many ways, it is a competing philosophy with Confucianism and offers critiques of the social and political theory. Of the two religions, Confucianism was the first to enjoy empirical patronage, so it was the first to become popular and widespread. After the Han Dynasty, however, Taoism and Buddhism flourished and eclipsed the tradition of Confucianism. This flourishing lasted from around the 3rd to the 7th centuries AD, during the 400 years or so between the Han and the Tang dynasties. Taoism draws its foundations from the school of naturalists in the form of its main elements, yin and yang, which developed during the Warring States period, 4th to the 3rd centuries BC. Some elements of Taoism may be traced to prehistoric folk religions in China that later coalesced into Taoist tradition. In particular, many Taoist practices drew from the Warring States era phenomenon of the Wu, connected to the shamanistic culture of the northern China, and the feng shui, or feng shui, which probably derived from the archivist soothsayers of antiquity. one of whom supposedly was Lao Tzu himself, even though later Taoists insisted that this was not the case. Both terms, Wu and Feng Shui, I'm sorry, you're going to have to bear with me. I'm not very good at these pronunciations, and I do not mean to make light of them, but sometimes the way that I pronounce them makes me chuckle a little bit. So, anyway, both terms Wu and Feng Shui, I think I'm saying that correctly, were used to designate individuals dedicated to magic, medicine, divination, methods of longevity, and to ecstatic wanderings, as well as exorcism. In the case of Wu, shamans or sorcerers is often used as a translation into English. The Feng Shui, or Feng Shui, were philosophically close to the school of naturalists and rely much on astrological and calendar speculations in their divinatory practices and activities. The first organized form of Taoism, the Tangsha, celestial masters, what they're called, the school, developed from the 5 pecks of rice movement at the end of the 2nd century AD. The latter had been founded by Zhang Duoling, who said that Lao Tzu appeared to him in the year 142 AD. The Tangsha school was officially recognized by ruler Cao Cao in 215, legitimizing Cao Cao's rise to power in return. By the Han Dynasty, which spanned between 206 BC to 220 AD, quite the long dynasty, the various sources of Taoism had coalesced into a coherent tradition of religious organizations and orders of ritualists in the state of Shu, modern Sichuan. In earlier ancient China, Taoists were thought of as hermits or recluses who did not participate in political life. Zhang Ji was the best known of these, and it is significant that he lived in the south, where he was part of local Chinese shamanistic traditions. Early Taoist movements developed their own institutions, in contrast to shamanism, but absorbed basic shamanistic elements. Shamans revealed basic texts of Taoism from earlier times down to at least the 20th century, which is relatively recent. Taoism gained official status in China during the Tang Dynasty, which went from 618 AD to 907 AD, whose emperors during that time claimed that Lao Tzu was their relative. But between 397 AD and 402 AD, Ji Chaofu compiled a series of scriptures which later served as the foundation of the Langbao school, which unfolded its greatest influence during the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty was between 960 AD and 1279 AD. So we're moving gently through history. So basically you can say that everything started between the 4th and 6th century AD. And then now we're moving through history to see how that has come about. Actually, several Song emperors, most notably Haozong, were active in promoting Taoism, collecting Taoist texts and publishing editions of the Taozang. In the 12th century, the Kuzang school was founded in Shandong. It flourished during the 13th and 14th centuries, and during the Yang Dynasty became the largest and most important Taoist school in northern China. The school's most revered master, Kuai Juli, met with Genghis Khan in 1222 AD and was successful in influencing Khan towards exerting more restraint during his brutal conquests. Aspects of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism were consciously synthesized in Neo-Confucian school, which eventually became imperial orthodoxy for state bureaucratic purposes under the Ming Dynasty. Ming Dynasty was 1368 AD all the way up to 1644 AD. During the Qing Dynasty, which was 1644 to 1912, however, due to discouragement of the government, many people favored Confucianism and Buddhist classics over Taoist works. During the 18th century, the Imperial Library was constituted, but excluded virtually all Taoist books. By the beginning of the 20th century, Taoism went through many cataclysmic events. As a result, only one complete copy of the Taoism, the Taoist scriptural canon, still remained at the White Cloud Monastery in Beijing. Today, Taoism is one of the 5 religions recognized by the People's Republic of China. The government regulates its activities through the Chinese Taoist Association, and Taoism is freely practiced in Taiwan, where it claims millions of adherents. But what do Taoists believe? Now that we know a little bit of history, what is it that they believe? When we come back, we'll find out just that. To answer the question before the first break, Buddhism would be the answer. Buddhism came way before Taoism did. And before this break, here's a question to ponder. What does the yin-yang symbol mean? And we'll be right back in just a minute. Welcome back to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. So, what is it that Taoists believe, and what does the yin-yang symbol mean? Let's find out. Taoism tends to emphasize various themes of the Tao Te Ching, the scriptural references for Taoists. The Tao Te Ching was supposedly written by Lao Tzu around the 4th century BC. In the Tao Te Ching, they support these various themes such as naturalism, spontaneity, simplicity, detachment from desires, and most important of all, Wu Wei. We'll get into Wu Wei in just a minute. First, let's look at the name Tao. Tao literally means way, but can also be interpreted as road, channel, path, doctrine, or line. Really, as you read through Taoism and you start to understand a lot more about Taoism, Taoism is really God, but not necessarily a deity. It's more the way of God, if you will. Actually, in Taoism, it is the one, which is natural, spontaneous, eternal, nameless, and indescribable. It is at once the beginning of all things and the way in which all things pursue their course. It has variously been denoted as the flow of the universe or a demonstration of nature. The Tao also is something that individuals can find within themselves. The active expression of Tao is called Ti, Te, in a sense that Ti results from an individual living and cultivating the Tao, the way. Now we get to Wu Wei. It's actually, Wu Wei is a principle that a martial art is based upon. And it's also Taoist concepts of values. So Wei, W-E-I, refers to any intentional or deliberate action, while Wu, which is W-U, carries the meaning of there is no, or lacking without. Common translations of Wu Wei are non-action, effortless action, or action without intent. The meaning is sometimes emphasized by using the paradoxical expression Wei Wu Wei, action without action. While it is hard to say, a phrase often used to sum up this idea is purposelessness. You can try to say that 4 or 5 times fast, but it's purposelessness, without purpose, basically without form. In ancient Taoist texts, Wu Wei is associated with water through its yielding nature. Taoist philosophy proposes that the universe works harmoniously according to its own ways. If you've ever listened to Bruce Lee, right, the famed martial artist, if you ever listen to his philosophy, there's an interesting interview he has where he talks about be like water, where you're formless, right, and you adapt to every situation. It's a very interesting interview, actually. But what he's talking about is Wu Wei. He's talking about living that way. When someone exerts their will against the world in a manner that is out of rhythm with the cycles of change, they may disrupt that harmony, and unintended consequences may more likely result rather than willed outcome. Very interesting concept. Taoism does not identify one's will as the root problem. Rather, it asserts that one must place their will in harmony with the natural universe. Thus, a potentially harmful interference may be avoided, and in this way, goals can be achieved effortlessly. By Wu Wei, the sage seeks to come into harmony with the great Tao, which itself accomplishes by non-action. Or so the quote goes. Ziran, I do not know how to say that. Ziran. It means self-such or self-organization, is regarded as a central value in Taoism. It describes the primordial state of all things as well as a basic character of the Tao, and it is usually associated with spontaneity and creativity. To attain naturalness, one has to identify with the Tao. This involves freeing oneself from selfishness and desire, and appreciating simplicity. An often cited metaphor for naturalists is Pu, P-U, spelled P-U. It means uncut wood, the uncut block, which represents the original natural state prior to the imprint of culture of an individual. It is usually referred to as a state one returns to. Moving on to the Taoist 3 treasures. So we've gone through Wu Wei, right? We've gone through some of the basics. Now we're going to get into the Taoist 3 treasures, or the 3 jewels. Now they comprise the basic virtues of compassion, moderation, and humility. A popular translation is abstention from aggressive war and capital punishment, compassion, absolute simplicity of living, moderation or humility, and refusal to assert active authority. Taoism can be defined as pantheistic. We'll get into the theology of Taoism. Taoism is defined as pantheistic, meaning many gods or everything is God. Given its philosophical emphasis on the formlessness of the Tao and the primacy of the Wei, rather than anthropomorphic concepts of God. This is one of the core beliefs that nearly all of the sects share. Taoist orders usually present the three pure ones at the top of the pantheon of deities, visualizing the hierarchy emanating from the Tao. Lao Tzu, or Lejean, or Lord Lao, is considered the incarnation of one of the three purities and worshipped as the ancestor of the philosophical doctrine, the writer of the Tao Te Ching, which is the philosophical side of Taoism. Different branches of Taoism often have differing pantheons of lesser deities, where these deities reflect different notions of cosmology. Lesser deities also may be promoted or demoted for their activity. Some varieties of popular Chinese religion incorporate the Jade Emperor, derived from the main of the three purities, as a representative of the Most High God. Perhaps you've seen that in movies somewhere. I think I have. Also, persons from the history of Taoism and people who are considered to have become immortals are venerated as well as both clergy and lay people. Despite these hierarchies of deities, traditional concepts of Taoism should not be confused with Western theism. Being one with the Tao does not necessarily indicate a union with an eternal spirit in, for example, the Hindu sense. So let's answer the question. What does the yin-yang symbol mean? The yin-yang symbol is meant to symbolize balance. In cosmology, the universe creates itself out of a primal chaos of material energy, organized into the cycles of yin and yang, and formed into objects and lives. Yin is the receptive, and yang is the active principles, seen in all forms of change and difference, such as the annual season cycles, the landscape or sexual coupling, the formation of men and women in characters, and social political history. Yin-yang is meant to symbolize the balance between all of these things. Again, denoting dualism. So now that we have seen what Taoists believe, in the last section of this episode, we'll get into how they live these principles and philosophies out, and get into an ancient story that is a very good representation of what this lifestyle looks like. Before the last break, I'd like to ask, if you were asked to paint a beautiful mural on a wall, what would you paint? I'll give you a minute to think about it, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. Before the break, I asked if you were to paint a mural on a wall, what would it look like? Can you picture it in your mind? Good. Before we find out what that has to do with the matter at hand, let's take a look at some rituals and other ways of participation when it comes to Taoism. In ancient times, before the Taoism religion was founded, food would sometimes be set out as a sacrifice to the spirits of the deceased or the gods. This could include slaughtered animals such as pigs and ducks or fruit. The Taoist celestial masters, Master Zhang Duling, rejected food and animal sacrifices to the gods. He tore apart temples which demanded animal sacrifices and drove away its priests. This rejection of sacrifices has continued into the modern day, as Taoism temples are not allowed to use animal sacrifices. Another form of sacrifice involves the burning of joss paper, spelled Joss, paper, or also called hell money, on the assumption that images thus consumed by the fire will reappear, not as a mere image, but as the actual item in the spirit world, making them available for revered ancestors and departed loved ones. Also, on particular holidays, street parades take place. These are lively affairs which invariably involve firecrackers and flower-covered floats broadcasting traditional music. They also variously include lion dances and dragon dances, human-occupied puppets, often of the seventh lord and eighth lord, kung fu practicing, and palanquins carrying god images. The various participants are not considered performers, but rather possessed by the gods and spirits in question. Fortune telling, including astrology, I Ching, and other forms of divination, have long been considered a traditional Taoist pursuit. Mediumship, where you become a medium, cross over and talk from spirit world into physical, is also widely encountered in some sections of Taoists. There is an academic and social distinction between martial form of mediumship and the spirit writing that is traditionally practiced through planchette writing. So now that we've seen where Taoism comes from, we've briefly touched upon the belief system and looked at some of the rituals and various ways of participating. It's story time, and as you might have guessed, it has to do with a mural on a wall. This story actually captures the essence of Taoism and is most likely based on true events centering around the Emperor Cao Cao in the 3rd century. So, sit back and enjoy. Our story begins with an emperor and empty palace walls. One day, the emperor, as he was walking through his palace, noticed a room where the walls were barren and empty. As he stared at the walls, wondering what he should do, he came up with an idea. He would have a contest. Since it was so hard to decide which religion or school of thought to have as the official state religion, he would hold a contest between Confucianism and Taoism. So he sent word to the leader of each that they should come to the palace at once. The next day, after their long journey, both schools showed up curious about what the emperor had in mind. As they arrived, they were told to meet outside the room with the empty walls, with the doors shut. Soon the emperor arrived and opened those doors to reveal the room. But now the room had a curtain used to split the room right down the middle. The emperor said, "Whichever school of thought can produce the most beautiful mural on the wall will be recognized by the state. You may have whatever you need to accomplish the task, but you only have 2 weeks in which to do it. Ask my servants for whatever you may need, and you may begin immediately." The Confucians ran in, picked the side they wanted, and quickly began making a list of all the supplies they would need. The Taoist walked in, stared at their side of the room for a while, and asked for the following from the servants: food, wine, and some pillows for each one of them. As the first week progressed, the Confucians drew out a beautiful landscape mural on the wall. They set about designing sections and designating each section for each person to do, and came up with shifts that they could work day and night. They appointed managers and set up schedules, and they worked and worked and worked. The Taoists took a different approach. They ate and drank and laughed. They reclined on the pillows they had asked for and ate and drank and laughed some more. And they took turns, each person using their pillow, rubbing the wall. During the second week, each time the servants brought the Taoists more food and drink, they observed them rubbing the wall. Some laying around, some rubbing the wall, all of them smiling and laughing and enjoying themselves. Each time the servants brought the Confucians their meal, it was at the same time every day, and every time they would all stop what they were doing, sit down, eat as fast as they could in silence, and return back to work. No laughter, no joy. As the week and the challenge drew closer to completion, the servants noticed that the Confucians seemed tense, anxious even, sometimes hostile towards one another, while the Taoists seemed to get more excited, more joyful, and the laughter and merriment seemed to increase until time was up and the day had finally arrived to reveal to the king the finished work. As the king's presence was announced and work ceased, the Confucians looked worried. Had they done a good enough job? What would the king think? Across the room, the Taoists refrained from laughter in favor of a gentle smile and a welcoming nature. The doors opened, and in walked the king. He went to the left side first to look at the Confucians' work. What he saw was breathtaking. It was his palace, in vivid detail, every tree, every statue, every stone in its place. The colors were gorgeous. The brushwork was so perfect. Wow, the king thought to himself. This is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. He turned to the Confucians and said, "Well done. It is beautiful." And now it was the Taoist's turn. He went around the curtain and confronted the Taoists and their work. When he looked at their wall, all he saw was a faint image he couldn't make out. So he asked, "What is this? Where is your mural?" The Taoist replied, "Sir, if we may make one more request." To which the king replied, "Certainly. What is it?" The Taoist asked that the king remove the curtain in the middle of the room. So the king had his servants take down the curtain, and he strolled to the middle of the room and looked at the wall yet again. What he saw was absolutely amazing. The wall that the Taoist had been working on for so long was reflecting the Confucian's wall, but in the Taoist wall, it had him also in the picture. And the way the light was hitting it made it seem as if the whole picture was somehow moving, like it was alive. The moral of this story was using the idea of Wu Wei, or effortless action, and flowing with things. Instead of trying to be rigid and bend things to your will, you will end up with something more beautiful. Life itself can be beautiful. Sometimes the most beautiful thing you can create is a lens in which to see it more clearly. In this episode, we have seen where Taoism comes from, briefly touched upon the belief system, and looked at the rituals and various ways of participating. We have summed up all of this with a story to better understand how these ideas are lived and how they work in the real world for Taoism and Taoists. In the next episode, it's time we moved westward towards the Middle East. We'll be looking at Islam. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. If you have, please subscribe and share with your friends, family members, and coworkers. New episode coming out on Wednesday at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific. Thank you very much for listening and watching. And as always, and in all ways, may God bless you. Thank you.